I never thought my own son will do this to me.
He married her in June, under a sky too clean to trust, the kind of sky that looks expensive, like it had been polished for photographs. She wore white silk that shimmered like the idea of wealth, and he, her only son, the boy who once slept on his mother's lap while the monsoon beat down on the roof, stood beside her, grinning like he'd just stepped into a newer, brighter version of himself. His mother sat in the second row, her sari simple, her hands folded politely in her lap. When the ceremony ended, she clapped with everyone else because that's what mothers do when their sons stop belonging to them. The rich wife came from a world of chandeliers and charity dinners, the kind of woman who said staff instead of help, and thought humility was a poetic inconvenience. For the first few weeks, she tolerated the mother's presence in the old house. She called her auntie, smiled with teeth that cost more than the woman's entire pension, and spoke in English even when she didn't need to. The son, caught between the two women, mistook the silence in the house for peace. But small irritations grew teeth. The rich wife didn't like the way the old woman dried laundry in the courtyard. She didn't like the smell of mustard oil in the kitchen. She didn't like the old brass gods on the shelf, watching her every move. "It's not about disrespect," she told her husband one night, swirling wine in a glass the color of guilt. "It's just not appropriate for where we are now." "Where we are now," the son nodded, tired from work and pride, and convinced himself that modernization was a form of love. The next morning he told his mother she should consider moving out for a while. "You'll be more comfortable," he said. "We'll get you a nice flat nearby." She didn't argue. She just looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable, then smiled faintly and said, "You always liked your comfort, Beta. I hope it keeps you warm." She left the next day with 2 suitcases, her wedding photo, and a small potted plant she'd grown from a cutting years ago. The house felt bigger without her, but not better. The rich wife replaced the old curtains, repainted the walls, and hung abstract art where family portraits used to be. She called it renovation. The neighbors called it erasure. The son prospered. His business grew, his wife's friends adored him, and every year he hosted grander parties in the house that once smelled of his mother's cooking. He told people he'd come from humble beginnings. As if humility were a disease he'd survived, the rich wife turned the backyard into a manicured garden, complete with imported roses and a fountain that whispered like money. Years passed quietly, as years do when you stop counting them with love. Then one winter afternoon, while the gardeners were replacing the soil near the old oak tree, a spade hit metal, a dull, hollow sound. The worker called his supervisor. They dug carefully until they unearthed a rusted tin box, sealed shut with wax that had long ago turned brittle. Inside were old documents, letters, and a diary wrapped in cloth. The first page read, in neat cursive, "Property deed, 1964. Owner, Mrs. Kamala Sharma." The rich wife frowned. She'd never heard that name before. She called her husband. He came home early, irritated by the interruption. When he saw the diary, something flickered in his eyes, a memory, half forgotten, half denied. He opened the next page. There, in his mother's handwriting, were words that turned the garden colder than the season. "To whoever lives here after me, this garden was once mine. Every tree planted with my hands, every root watered with my breath. I sold this land to a man who promised it would shelter another family. Perhaps it became yours. If so, take care of it. Soil remembers kindness better than people do." The son read it twice, the words trembling on his lips. Beneath the diary was a photograph, his mother, younger, standing under the same oak tree, a small boy on her hip. Him. The rich wife felt a strange chill. She called for the gardener and told him to stop digging, but the son kept reading, his voice cracking as he found the last entry. "If my boy ever finds this place, tell him not to feel sorry. The house was never mine. It was his father's gift, his wife's desire, his son's ambition. I only borrowed it long enough to make it a home. I hope it stayed one." He sat down on the grass, the diary trembling in his hands. The fountain kept murmuring, indifferent. The garden smelled of roses and regret. That night the party went on as usual. Music, laughter, wine. But he barely spoke. His wife noticed and whispered, "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. Later, when everyone had gone, he walked barefoot into the garden, found the spot where the box had been buried, and sat beside it until dawn. The next morning, he asked the gardener to plant marigolds there, his mother's favorite. The rich wife didn't protest. Something in his face told her not to. Years later, when people passed by the grand house, they'd notice a single flower bed by the gate, bright marigolds blooming stubbornly against the trimmed hedges. No one knew why they were there, or why the owner, now older and quieter, watered them himself every morning before sunrise. And sometimes, when the wind moved through the garden just right, it carried the faintest scent of mustard oil and wet earth, like the house was remembering who had loved it first. A year passed after the discovery of the tin box, and though the garden grew fuller, the house felt emptier. The rich wife still hosted her parties, her friends still came and went in their perfume and laughter, but the sound of joy never quite reached the second floor anymore. The son had stopped playing music in the evenings. He no longer filled his glass twice. He had developed a quiet habit of standing by the window before bed, looking at the marigolds that burned gold even in moonlight. Sometimes he thought he saw her there, his mother, sitting beneath the oak tree with her diary open, the same half-smile she always wore when she was too proud to cry. He'd blink, and the image would dissolve, replaced by the soft shimmer of dew on petals. But the guilt didn't dissolve. Guilt, he'd learned, doesn't evaporate. It blooms. He tried to make amends in small ways. He donated to charities, bought books for a local school, even built a small fountain near the marigolds, engraved with the words, "For the woman who taught me how to plant roots." But the inscription only deepened the ache, because he knew he had learned the lesson too late. The rich wife noticed the change in him. He was quieter at dinner, gentler in his speech. Sometimes he would pick up his mother's old recipes and try to cook them, the kitchen filling with clumsy attempts and the smell of burnt mustard seeds. She never scolded him. She had grown used to the ghosts he was now living with. One afternoon, while rearranging the library, she came across an old letter that had slipped between the books. It was addressed to her husband in his mother's handwriting. The ink was faint, but the words were clear. "Bishta, if life ever makes you choose between comfort and kindness, choose kindness. Comfort can be built again. Kindness, once lost, leaves a hollow that never fills." She read the letter twice before tucking it back carefully. That evening she walked out into the garden with a pair of gardening gloves and a watering can. She knelt by the marigolds. The soil was cool, the air sharp with evening chill. She stayed there until her husband returned from work. When he saw her, knees covered in dirt, hands trembling slightly, he stopped at the doorway. "I didn't know you liked gardening," he said softly. "I didn't," she said, still looking at the flowers, but she did. They stood together in silence. The fountain murmured. A soft wind ran through the leaves. For the first time in years, the air between them felt real, unadorned, humble, alive. After that day, she started tending the marigolds regularly. It became their shared ritual. Every Sunday morning, they would water the plants together, pull out the weeds, and talk about nothing in particular. Neighbors would watch them sometimes and whisper how strange it was, how the woman who had once despised soil now looked like she was praying to it. One day, while digging to plant new seeds, she hit something solid. It wasn't metal this time, but wood, softened by time. She called her husband over. They unearthed a small wooden box, lighter than air, tied shut with a faded red ribbon. Inside were three things: an old photograph of the son as a boy, standing with his mother under the same oak tree, a locket with a tiny pressed marigold inside, and a note: "If you've found this, you've finally looked down instead of up. I always hoped you would. The house may be yours now, but remember, it was built with love that didn't need a deed." He held the note for a long time. The rich wife watched him kneel in the dirt, eyes closed, lips moving in silence. When he finally stood up, he placed the photograph against the base of the oak tree. That night, he dreamed of her again. Not sad or distant this time, but sitting on the porch, her hands dusted with flour, humming softly while the wind carried the smell of baking. She looked at him and said, "I knew you'd remember eventually." He woke before dawn, the echo of her voice still in the air. He went outside barefoot and sat by the marigolds. The soil was damp from the night's rain. The sky was turning pink. He whispered, "I'm sorry, Ma," not expecting an answer, but feeling one anyway. The rich wife joined him a few minutes later, bringing 2 cups of tea. She didn't speak. They sat together, watching the first light slip across the flowers. Somewhere, a bird sang. The house behind them stood silent but softer, like it had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. And when the wind picked up, carrying the scent of marigolds through the open kitchen window, it didn't smell like regret anymore. It smelled like forgiveness. In the months that followed, life rearranged itself quietly, like furniture moved in the dark. Nothing dramatic happened. No confessions, no thunderclap redemption, just small, persistent acts of remembrance. The rich wife began rising early to brew tea before her husband woke, the way his mother once had. He started reading again, his books spread across the table she used to polish every Sunday. The marigolds outside bloomed so fiercely that the whole garden seemed to glow at dusk. One morning, while watering the plants, he noticed a small green shoot sprouting at the edge of the path. It wasn't part of the flower bed. It had found its own way through a crack in the stone. He crouched down, touched it gently, and smiled. It reminded him of her, stubborn, quiet, impossible to uproot. He let it grow. Sometimes neighbors passing by would stop to comment on how beautiful the garden had become. The rich wife would nod and thank them, but inside, she knew it wasn't her garden at all. It belonged to someone whose hands still lived in the soil. When visitors asked what kind of fertilizer she used, she'd laugh softly and say, "Regret and rain." The house itself had softened too. The rich wife had taken down the abstract paintings and replaced them with old photographs. She kept one on the hallway table, his mother smiling with a tray of food, her eyes bright with that particular light only women who build homes from nothing seem to have. On the wall nearby, she hung a framed quote in delicate script: "Kindness is the only inheritance worth keeping." She didn't tell anyone she'd taken the line from the old letter she found between the books. As for the son, he stopped introducing himself as self-made. At parties, when people praised his success, he'd smile politely and say, "I had help." No one understood what he meant, but the humility suited him. When his company turned a profit that year, he donated a portion quietly to a women's shelter and named the wing the Kamala Foundation. The plaque bore no surname, just those 2 words, and a small engraving of a marigold. Every night before locking up, he'd walk through the garden. The fountain's gentle trickle kept time with his steps. He'd pause beneath the oak tree, run a hand over the wooden box buried deep below, and whisper something too soft for the stars to hear. The rich wife often watched from the window, her heart folding in on itself with something that wasn't sadness, not exactly, something closer to awe. One evening in late autumn, they hosted a small dinner, just a few close friends. The air was cool, and they decided to eat outside under the fairy lights strung along the fence. Midway through, their young niece pointed toward the marigolds and asked, "Why do you water those every day?" "They look old," the son smiled. "Because they remember us," he said, "even when we forget ourselves." The table fell quiet for a moment, and the sound of the fountain filled the gap where words usually live. Later, when everyone had gone, the rich wife found him still sitting outside, staring at the flowers. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think your mother was in the way. Now I think she's the only thing holding this house together." He turned to her, eyes glistening. "She was always better at building than we were," he said. "We just planted over her." They sat like that until the lights flickered out, until the garden folded itself into shadow. The moon rose over the roof, pale and deliberate. A breeze swept through, stirring the marigolds, carrying their scent through the open window and across the rooms that had finally learned how to breathe again. And in that quiet, if you listened closely enough, you could almost hear it. The faint rhythm of a woman's footsteps on the old kitchen tiles, the sound of water boiling somewhere far away, and a voice, unsoft, amused, full of love, saying, "Good. You finally learned to keep the soil warm." By the time spring returned, the house on Willow Lane had stopped being a monument to regret. It had become something gentler, a place that remembered without hurting. The marigolds had multiplied again, spilling beyond the borders of the flower bed into the gravel path. The oak tree stood taller, its roots holding the earth as if it understood it was guarding a secret. The sun had grown older in the face, but quieter in the eyes. There was a peace there now, the kind that comes only after the heart runs out of excuses. He had started inviting the neighborhood children into the garden on weekends. He taught them how to plant seeds, how to water without drowning, how to wait. When one of them asked why he liked marigolds so much, he smiled and said, "They're strong flowers. They forgive the weather." The rich wife would watch from the window, her hands folded around a mug of tea. She still wore her pearls, still had her sharp, elegant edges, but the vanity had dulled into something softer. She had learned to listen. Sometimes she caught herself humming old songs she didn't remember learning. The melody always came back to her like muscle memory, as though the house itself was teaching her what it once heard through its walls. One day she found her husband kneeling by the marigolds with a small notebook open on his lap. He was writing something. When she came closer, she saw he was sketching a plan for a small public park. He looked up at her, embarrassed, like a child caught daydreaming. "I thought maybe we could give this garden away," he said. "Make it a place for everyone. For people who need a bit of quiet." Her first instinct was to protest. After all, it was their property, but she saw something in his expression that stopped her, the same stubborn gentleness that used to live in his mother's face. "All right," she said, "let's do it." The paperwork took months. He transferred part of the land to the local council, requesting it be turned into a small community garden. When it opened, there was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no speeches. Just a simple wooden sign near the gate that read, "Kamala's Garden, where kindness grows." People started coming, old couples, children, young mothers with strollers. They sat under the oak tree, read books, shared lunches. The marigolds flourished as if they'd been waiting for applause. The son and his wife visited often, not as owners, but as caretakers. Every week they'd plant something new, lavender, tulips, jasmine. But the marigolds always stayed in the center, the heart of the soil. One afternoon, while pruning the edges, The rich wife found a small stone half buried near the fountain. It was smooth and faintly carved. She brushed away the dirt and saw 2 letters etched into it, K.S. She ran her thumb over them slowly, the corners of her mouth lifting into a smile that was almost reverence. "She's still here," she whispered. When she showed it to her husband later, he took the stone, kissed it gently, and placed it beneath the oak tree. "That's where she wanted to be," he said, "watching." In the evenings, when the park emptied and the street lights flickered on, they would sit together on the bench by the gate. Sometimes they talked about nothing. Sometimes they said her name aloud, like a prayer that no longer hurt to speak. He had stopped celebrating his birthday years ago, but on what would have been his 40th, the rich wife surprised him with a cake, small, simple, frosted with marigold petals. He laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in a long while. "You remembered," he said. "I remember everything now," she replied. He blew out the candle, and for a moment the world felt suspended. No past, no punishment, just the faint glow of what love leaves behind when it's done breaking you. They stayed there until the stars came out, the garden shimmered under the moonlight, every flower leaning toward the sky. The fountain whispered softly, water over stone, a language only time and forgiveness could speak. And if you stood at the edge of the park that night, you might have heard it, a faint hum in the air, like an old tune being remembered by the wind. The sound of a mother's voice, low and amused, whispering through the marigolds. "You finally learned, my boy. You made a home worth keeping." He looked up at the tree, eyes wet but smiling. "I did, Ma," he said under his breath. "I did." The leaves rustled just once, as if in approval, and then the night folded itself around the garden, keeping the secret safe, a story of loss and return, of soil and forgiveness, of a woman who left nothing behind except everything that mattered. Years drifted by quietly, as years do when you've stopped waiting for life to apologize. The house beside Kamala's garden still stood, but it was no longer the grand display it once was. The expensive cars were gone, the laughter of shallow friends replaced by children's giggles spilling over from the park next door. The walls had softened with time, the sharp edges of luxury blurred into the comfortable wear of memory. The son, gray now, slower in his movements but lighter in his heart, spent his mornings sitting by the oak tree. Sometimes he'd bring a small stool and a thermos of tea, the same kind his mother used to brew. The park had become his second home. He didn't own it, not legally, but it belonged to him in every way that mattered. He'd talk to the people who came, tell them how to care for the marigolds, when to water them, when to leave them alone. Children called him Uncle, though some of the older ones called him Grandpa Garden. He liked that. The rich wife had grown gentler, too. Her voice had lost its crispness, her laughter had gained depth. She often helped maintain the benches, painting over scratches, arranging flowers near the gate. She wore simple cotton saris now, her diamonds replaced by small gold studs. Once a visitor mistook her for a caretaker, and she'd smiled instead of correcting them. "In a way I am," she'd said. "We're all just keeping things alive until someone else takes over." Every year, on the anniversary of his mother's passing, they would light candles under the oak tree. At first it was just the 2 of them. Then the neighbors joined in, then the children, then strangers who had only ever known Kamala's garden by name. It became a ritual, a celebration of love that had outlived its mistakes. The marigolds glowed like 100 small suns, and in their light, everyone looked forgiven. One evening, while walking home from the garden, the son paused by the gate. The old wooden sign had begun to crack from the years of rain and wind. He ran his fingers over the carved words, "Kamala's Garden, where kindness grows," and smiled. "It's time to fix this," he said. A week later, a new sign appeared in its place. The same message, but now carved in stone instead of wood. Beneath it, a new line had been added in smaller letters. Founded by the son who learned too late and the mother who forgave anyway. The morning the sign was installed, he sat in front of it for a long time, watching the sunlight catch on the lettering. He wasn't sad. He wasn't even proud. He just felt still. He reached into his pocket and took out an old brass key, the one that used to open his mother's house long before he'd locked her out of it. He'd kept it all these years, unable to throw it away, unable to use it. He placed it gently at the base of the stone and whispered, "You can have it back now, Ma." The key gleamed briefly in the light before the shadows of the oak branches crossed over it, like an old hand closing softly around a child's fingers. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the marigolds turned to gold, he and his wife sat together on the bench. "Do you think she knows?" the wife asked. He smiled faintly. "She always knew," he said, "even when I didn't." A soft breeze moved through the garden, stirring the petals, lifting a faint scent of mustard oil and earth. It brushed across their faces like a benediction. Somewhere in the distance a kettle whistled, someone boiling water for evening tea, and the sound carried through the air like a memory that had finally come full circle. The son leaned back, eyes half closed, listening. "That's her," he said quietly. "She's still here." And for the first time in decades, the house, the garden, the oak, and every marigold seemed to exhale together, the way living things do when they finally understand they were never separate at all. As dusk settled, a child ran past the bench and called out, "Uncle, will the marigolds bloom again next year?" He smiled, his voice warm and sure. "They always do." The child nodded and ran off, the echo of laughter fading into the dark. And under the soft orange glow of the setting sun, the marigolds swayed gently in the evening wind, each bloom a small burning prayer in the soil his mother once touched. The wind carried their fragrance beyond the walls, down the lane, out into the city, until no one could tell where the garden ended and kindness began. As the years turned and the city around Kamala's garden grew taller, louder, and hungrier for space, the small patch of earth remained untouched, a miracle in a world that kept forgetting what mattered. Towers rose around it, roads widened, shops opened and closed, but the garden stayed, breathing quietly in the middle of all that haste. Children who had once planted flowers there grew up and brought their own children to play under the oak tree. They'd point to the 3 names on the stone, Kamala, Rajiv, Meera, and tell the story the way people tell myths, part truth, part tenderness, all faith. They'd say, "This garden wasn't always here. It grew out of forgiveness," and every time the listener would go silent for a moment, looking at the marigolds and understanding, without needing all the details, that some stories belong to everyone. One spring afternoon, a little girl named Ria wandered into the garden. She was 8, curious and armed with a small sketchbook she carried everywhere. Her school was nearby, and she often came to the garden after class, sitting cross-legged near the fountain to draw the flowers. She liked the way the marigolds never seemed to get tired of being beautiful. That day, while sketching, she noticed something odd, a single white flower growing near the oak tree. It wasn't a marigold. Its petals were slender and pale, like light caught in bloom. She touched it carefully and found a small brass tag stuck in the soil beside it. The tag had only one word engraved, "Home." She showed it to the old gardener who worked there, a kind man with shaking hands and patient eyes. He smiled when he saw it. "That wasn't here yesterday," he said softly. "Who put it there?" she asked. "Maybe the garden did," he said. He watched her trace the word with her finger. "You should leave it," he added. "It belongs here now." Ria nodded, then spent the next hour drawing it, the single white flower surrounded by a sea of orange marigolds. When she finished, she tore the page out of her sketchbook and gave it to the gardener. "For the people who made this place," she said. He took it carefully, his eyes warm. "They'll like that," he said. "They always did love small things done with care." That drawing ended up hanging inside the tiny shed near the gate. Visitors saw it often, a simple sketch, a single white flower, and the word home. It became the garden's quiet emblem. People left little brass tags of their own after that, some with names, some with wishes. Love. Peace. Forgive. Stay. Over the years, hundreds of them filled the soil, glinting softly in the sunlight. The oak tree kept growing, its roots wrapping around every secret. The fountain still whispered, the marigolds still flamed into bloom every season, never missing a year. And sometimes, when evening fell just right, that golden hour when shadows were kind and the city noise dulled to a hum, a faint scent of mustard oil drifted through the air. No one could explain it. It came from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. People said it was the trees, or maybe the wind from the old neighborhoods, but the old gardener, who'd been there long enough to know the difference, would simply smile and say, "That's Kamala checking in." She never liked to stay away too long. Every story that begins in pain eventually finds a place to rest, and Kamala's found hers here, in petals, in laughter, in the slow grace of growing things. The son's mistakes had long been forgiven. The rich wife's pride had long been softened into care, and the mother, whose love had been tested and proven in silence, lived on, not in memory, but in practice. Because somewhere, in every kindness, there's a trace of her. In a cup of tea shared with a neighbor, in a seed planted without expectation, in a word spoken gently when anger would have been easier. Kamala's garden was no longer a place. It had become an inheritance. And on certain mornings when the sun is still low and the mist curls around the marigolds, people swear they can hear faint laughter near the oak. 2 voices, maybe 3. One low and amused, one warm and steady, one still learning how to love. If you stand very still, you'll hear them say, "You see? It's still growing, and the garden, golden and quiet, answers back with the rustle of leaves and the whisper of soil. Yes, it always will." Decades passed, and the garden outlived everyone who had once needed it most. Kamala's garden became part of the city's soul, a landmark people gave directions by, a sanctuary where time moved slower than anywhere else. Urban planners tried to buy the land twice, dreaming of glass towers and boutique cafes, but each time petitions filled the streets. People didn't call it property anymore, they called it belonging. By then, the oak tree had grown vast. Roots like a memory system, trunk thick enough to carry the weight of generations. Birds nested in its branches, lovers carved initials into its bark, and in spring, when the wind blew hard enough, marigold petals would swirl through the air like saffron snow. The old gardener had retired long ago, but his apprentice, a quiet man named Arjun, kept the garden alive. He had grown up playing among these flowers, listening to stories of Kamala and her son, of the house that once forgot how to love. The first thing he'd ever learned to write as a boy was the word on that brass tag, home. Every morning he'd walk through the gate and run his hand over the plaque. The letters were faded now, but still clear. Kindness does not die. It takes root. He'd whisper a greeting, not to anyone in particular, but to the soil itself, as though it might whisper back. One rainy afternoon, while trimming the marigolds, he noticed a small figure near the oak tree, a woman in her 20s, sitting cross-legged in the damp grass. She was sketching something in a notebook, her pencil moving fast but delicate. He recognized that kind of silence, the kind filled with remembering. He walked closer and said softly, "You'll catch a cold sitting there." She looked up, startled but smiling. "I'm fine," she said. "My grandmother used to bring me here." I wanted to see if it still looked the same. He tilted his head. "Who was your grandmother?" "Rhea," she said. "She used to draw the garden when she was little." I found her old sketchbook after she passed. It's full of marigolds. He smiled. "Then I think you're standing in the right place." She nodded, glancing toward the oak tree. "She used to tell me the story," she said. "The mother, the son, the rich wife. But she always said the ending wasn't really about forgiveness. She said it was about learning to love again, even when you don't think you can." Arjun nodded. She was right. The woman tore a page from her sketchbook and handed it to him. It was a drawing of the oak tree, surrounded by marigolds, and above them, faint outlines of 3 figures, almost invisible, drawn in thin pencil strokes. "For the garden," she said. He took it carefully. "It'll stay here," he promised. When she left, he placed the drawing inside the old shed beside the one that Rhea, her grandmother, had drawn decades earlier. The 2 sketches hung side by side now, the past and the present meeting, quietly on a wall of fading paint. Later that evening, as the rain eased and the light turned to that soft orange that always made the garden look half-remembered, Arjun walked to the oak tree and looked up through its branches. Drops of rain slid down the leaves like tears that had forgotten their purpose. "You see," he murmured, "they're still coming back." A breeze passed through the garden, lifting the scent of wet soil and flowers. The marigolds bent gently in agreement. Somewhere a kettle whistled, faint and far, as if the sound were traveling across years to find its way home. The next morning, a small brass tag appeared near the oak tree. No one saw who placed it there. It simply read, "For everyone who leaves and everyone who returns." People noticed it during their walks, smiled, and added new tags nearby. The soil around the oak began to shimmer with dozens of brass glints, a constellation of memory. And so the story continued, not in words but in gestures. A flower replanted, a name whispered, a tear wiped away in sunlight. By the time another century rolled through, Kamala's garden had become legend. Some said it was built by a mother and son who once hurt each other and then healed. Some said it had always been there, just a gift from the earth itself. No one really knew anymore, but everyone who entered left quieter, softer, kinder. The marigold still bloomed, the oak still stood, the air still smelled faintly of mustard oil after rain, and when the wind passed through, people sometimes thought they heard it. 3 voices carried through the leaves, gentle and amused, still talking after all this time. Do you think they remember us? They don't need to. We're in them now. Good. Then let it grow. And the wind, faithful as ever, kept its promise, carrying their laughter through the flowers, over the soil, into the streets beyond. So the garden stayed, glowing softly in the heart of the city, teaching everyone who passed through its gate the same quiet lesson: love can be buried. But it always finds a way to bloom again. The garden never stopped changing, but it never really changed at all. Seasons still turned the marigolds gold, the air still hummed with quiet, and the oak tree still held its watch. In the city around it, people came and went, new faces, new stories, but the soil beneath the tree carried every name it had ever known. One morning, many years later, a small group of school children arrived with their teacher. They came every year for what the school called Kindness Day, a tradition that had outlasted everyone who started it. Each child carried a small clay pot with a single seed inside. They would plant them near the marigolds and promise to take care of them, at least until the next visit. Among them was a boy who didn't speak much. He had joined the school mid-year, thin and quiet, eyes too old for his age. When the others knelt to plant their seeds, he just stood there, staring at the oak tree. The teacher noticed and walked over. "Would you like me to help you plant yours?" The boy shook his head. "My grandmother used to tell me about this tree," he said softly. "She said her grandmother drew it once." The teacher smiled. "Then I think this is exactly where your seed belongs." The boy knelt and dug a small hole with his fingers. He placed the seed in, covered it gently, and whispered something the teacher couldn't hear. When he looked up, he asked, "Do you think trees remember people?" "Yes," the teacher said without hesitation. "Especially this one." The boy nodded, satisfied, and pressed his palms together like a prayer. As the children left, the gardener, old Arjun now stooped and gray, watched them from the gate. He smiled at the boy, something familiar in the way he looked at the tree, the way he touched the soil. He waited until everyone had gone, and then walked to where the boy had planted his seed. The earth there felt warm, almost pulsing. "Another one, eh?" he murmured to the soil. "You never stop finding them, do you?" The wind answered softly through the branches. Arjun looked up at the oak, his voice barely a whisper. "When it's my turn to rest, make room, all right?" The leaves rustled as though in promise. A few years later, when Arjun passed away, the community gathered again beneath the oak tree. They buried his ashes beside the brass tags, beside the roots that had already claimed so much love. Someone asked what words should go on his marker. One of the teachers who'd known him said he didn't want a name. He said the garden already had one, so they carved just this, the hands that kept the promise. The children planted more marigolds around it. The boy, older now, taller, still quiet, watered them himself. And so Kamala's garden lived on. Decades turned into centuries, and stories blurred into legend. The city grew denser, its skyline a crown of glass, but in the middle of it all, the garden remained like a heart that refused to stop beating. People said the air inside it felt different, lighter, kinder. Some said if you sat beneath the oak tree long enough, you could feel warmth rising through the ground, like someone holding your hand from below. Couples got married there, children learned to walk there. Strangers came to weep and left softer than they'd arrived. The marigolds never failed to bloom. Even when drought hit the city and other parks went dry, Kamala's garden stayed green. No one could explain why, but the old records, the ones kept by the city's historical trust, mentioned 3 names carved on the first stone: Kamala, Rajiv, Meera, and beneath them a 4th added later, Arjun. No one knew who they were anymore, but the garden did. On the 100th anniversary of the park's founding, the mayor gave a speech. Reporters came, cameras flashed, but all the noise faded when an old woman from the neighborhood stepped up to the microphone. She wasn't part of the program, but the crowd went silent when she began to speak. "My grandmother brought me here when I was little," she said. "She said this garden was built from forgiveness, that every flower was once a mistake that someone loved enough to fix." She pointed to the marigolds. "You can build towers, you can fill streets with light, but nothing lasts like kindness. This place, this soil, proved it." Then she stepped back, leaving the crowd quiet enough to hear the fountain. That night, after everyone left, the garden glowed faintly under the moonlight. Fireflies drifted among the marigolds like moving stars. The brass tags near the oak tree gleamed in the dark. Hundreds of them now, a map of every heart that had ever found its way back here. And if you stood beneath the oak, you might have sworn you heard it again. Not a voice exactly, but something deeper. A rhythm, a pulse, a quiet laughter carried in the wind. "We told you, it seemed to say. Love doesn't end. It grows roots. The marigolds swayed gently in the night air, the fountain murmured its endless song, and somewhere beyond the veil of time, 3 souls, perhaps 4 now, sat together, sipping tea in the soft light of forever, and the garden, faithful and golden, went on blooming.
And still, it bloomed. Long after the city changed names, governments, even languages, when streets were renamed and faces forgot where stories began, Kamala's garden stayed. The old oak was enormous now, its trunk wide enough to hold the laughter of centuries. It had watched over 1,000 sunrises and as many mistakes, its roots tangled with memories too deep for history to unearth. No one remembered when the fountain stopped working, but the sound of water had never really left. The wind still carried it, soft as a hum in the leaves, and when people came to rest under the tree, they swore they could feel it, that quiet rhythm beneath the ground, as if the earth itself were breathing in time with them. The city, by then, had wrapped itself around the garden like an embrace that never wanted to let go. Glass towers mirrored its gold every morning. Office workers came at lunch to eat in silence. Lovers met by the gate in the evening, carving small initials into the stone. No one called it Kamala's garden anymore. It was just the garden. The name had outlived the story, but the feeling hadn't. One winter evening, an archivist from the city's Historical Preservation Council visited. She was young, new to the job, and had been told to document the garden's origin for a digital museum project. She arrived at dusk with a scanner and notebook, expecting to find just a plaque and a tree.
But when she walked inside, something about the air made her stop. It felt alive, full, warm, patient. The marigolds were still blooming, even though the season said they shouldn't. A few petals had fallen into the soil, and the smell, faint mustard, faint tea, faint smoke from long-ago kitchens, felt like a memory she hadn't lived but somehow missed. She found the plaque, worn smooth with age, its words almost invisible. She crouched, tracing her fingers over the indentations. Kindness does not die, it takes root. She smiled, whispered the line aloud, and began recording. Her scanner picked up something unusual. Faint electromagnetic interference, a low hum near the base of the tree. She leaned closer, her device trembling slightly, and then, through the static, she heard it. Home. She froze. It wasn't wind. It wasn't echo. It was a voice. Distant, delicate, like someone speaking through layers of time. Tell them. We're still here.
Her eyes filled without warning. She turned off the scanner and pressed her hand against the bark. I hear you, she whispered. I'll remember. That night, back in her small apartment, she wrote a report titled Kamala's Garden, Origins Unknown. But in the notes section, instead of data, she wrote, The garden is not a place. It's a conversation that never ended. When the report was published, people began visiting again, not as tourists, but as pilgrims. The old legends resurfaced, retold in new tongues, reshaped but never emptied. The story of the mother, the son, and the woman who learned to stay, whispered from benches, taught in classrooms, sung quietly by street performers at dusk. And as the city's nights grew brighter, the garden stayed a pocket of dark, calm gold in the middle of it all. A reminder that not everything worth keeping can be built again.
One evening, as the archivist passed through after work, she saw a boy sitting cross-legged under the oak, drawing in the dirt with a stick. He looked up at her and said, Did you know the tree talks? She smiled. What does it say? He shrugged. Depends who's listening. He grinned and ran off before she could ask his name. When she turned back toward the tree, the wind moved through its branches, and for a moment she thought she heard it. A faint, familiar murmur carried through leaves older than memory. See? They still know how to listen, and the marigolds, golden as ever, bent in quiet applause. Generations more would come. The story would fade and bloom, be forgotten and found again like the seasons themselves. But as long as someone planted something in kindness, a seed, a word, a gesture, the garden would breathe. Because love, once rooted, does not end. It waits, it watches, and when the world forgets, it flowers.